Good evening. My name is Franky Abbott, and I serve as the Chief Content Strategist here at Levine Museum of the New South. Welcome to tonight's program, What's It Going to Take? Voting Rights. Thank you for joining us. If you wish to support the museum and its efforts to offer engaging programming, content, and experiences, please follow the link in the comments. We also really appreciate your feedback about tonight's program and your suggestions for future topics that we can do programs about. Feedback helps us make our programs much better. Please click on the survey link in the comments section for a very short survey at any point during the program. Tonight, we're going to discuss some of today's most pressing voting rights issues in historical context with what I can say is a fabulous panel of experts. Please welcome Regan Aduddell, Co-President and Chair of Voter Services at the League of Women Voters of Charlotte-Mecklenburg, Dr. Martha Kropf, Professor of Political Science and Public Administration at UNC Charlotte, and Kristie Puckett-Williams, civil rights activist and the Smart Justice Manager for the ACLU of North Carolina. Welcome to all of you. Before we begin, a reminder to the audience that we're eager to hear your thoughts, so please use the comment feature to send us questions or ideas at any point throughout the program. We have so many things to talk about, and I'm really excited to start the conversation. But I thought we would start by sort of grounding ourselves in history with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Just as a reminder, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is a landmark piece of federal legislation. It was designed to enforce the 15th Amendment by outlawing racially discriminatory voting practices that had been adopted by many southern states and some other localities after the Civil War. A historical reminder, 1965 is 95 years after the passage of the 15th Amendment. So those things continue to be a problem, and in many ways, some of them continue to be a problem today. So let's get into it. Since the Voting Rights Act of 1965, what are some of the major judicial and legislative events that have impacted the Voting Rights Act in recent decades, and sort of what has the impact been? I'm going to start with Martha.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. Just as an aside for a little bit of context about elections first, just keep in mind that elections in the United States are, well, hyper decentralized. The states have power over making most legislation concerning who can vote and who can't. And the states then administer a lot of power to run local or run federal and state elections to local administrators. So in North Carolina, for example, we have a county board of elections and an election director, et cetera, et cetera. But the federal government has often tried to step in where it concerns civil rights. At least this has been the past history. So, you know, as you noted, there are several amendments to the Constitution, but even in the face of amendments to the Constitution, like the 15th Amendment, there were still states that were sort of holdouts in providing fair access to the ballot to some individuals, particularly, obviously, minority individuals, Black individuals in the United States. And ultimately, the federal government passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that legislation was supposed to do, there was a couple of key things that I can talk about. First was it had Section 5, which set up pre-clearance for states that had this history of voting rights violations. Basically, it froze voting rights laws. And in order to change the laws, any of these places had to apply for pre-clearance to change any of the laws. And the Department of Justice or the Federal District Court of Washington, D.C. would examine the changes to see if they violated voting rights. And this was good law for a very long time until 2013. And that's when the Supreme Court struck down Section 5 in the holding Shelby v. Holder, which basically found that the sort of the jurisdictions that were selected for this, I don't remember the language exactly, but it was illegally done, and therefore it basically gutted Section 5 by knocking out the selection of jurisdictions for pre-clearance. So that covered not just the South, though. That covered Native American areas and many other sorts of voting rights problems that we have for minorities. And so that was a big loss, because not too long after that, North Carolina passed that big monster voting law, as some people like to call it. And I'll add then, but that's where Section 2 comes into play. And Section 2, until very recently, not at first, but later on in 1982, it was how if a law affected minorities differently, it had nothing to do with the intent of passing the laws. If it affected minorities differently, then that law could be taken to court. And so the Department of Justice, actually, depending on the presidential administration, would take a lot of laws, law by law, to court in order to challenge them. And for redistricting, it's worked reasonably well, and a set of standards have come up. But because of Section 5, a lot of the voter suppression things haven't been challenged under Section 2, which says you can't discriminate, essentially. But last year there was a court case that knocked out a couple of that challenged a couple of Arizona laws that had a disproportionate impact on some Native Americans in particular. And the court upheld the law, which sort of brought into question whether or not Section 2 would be able to support some of the challenges that we're going to definitely need to have, given some of the important things. Now, in redistricting, we've always thought it was safe. But I am, we were talking before the show about a Supreme Court case that was decided yesterday, and I'm going to let someone else address that. But the Voting Rights Act was there to protect Minority Voting Rights Act voting rights, and some made the argument it was the most successful piece of civil rights legislation ever passed. So with that, I'll pass it on to whoever else.
Anyone want to give, I did not live in North Carolina, but I certainly lived in the United States when the Monster Law was passed and challenged, and then sort of not picked up by the Supreme Court, HB 589, I think.
Yes.
Which was a piece of legislation that I think essentially was written and then really picked up steam after Shelby v. Holder. When it became clear.
They actually changed it really quickly right after Shelby v.
Right. They changed it right after that. And some of the things like instituting a photo ID. Mm-hmm. We had canceled same-day voter registration. We really cut down on early registration, and they actually then cut down on Sunday voting. And they admitted it was because that is where the African Americans would have souls to the polls. And there was no hiding it. They said that's why they did it. And when it was shot down, it was cut down because the judge said it targeted African Americans with surgical precision. So there was no hiding what they were trying to do or what was trying to do. And it was limit and decrease the access to the vote. And it was mostly minorities that they were targeting. That was voted down, but we continue to have, as we all know, attacks or laws that are passed under, we're trying to do election integrity, but they do end up targeting and harming voters, mostly of like the Native Americans, the African Americans, Hispanic communities.
And, we still have, as a amendment on our North Carolina Constitution, a literacy test that has not been repealed. And so like that relic of a Jim Crow era of a literacy test still is something that could go up for a referendum, but there's still people like Representative Sarah Stevenson saying, well, shouldn't people know how to read and write before they can vote? Without admitting the historical implications that this was adopted in 1900 by North Carolina specifically to keep African Americans and Black folks from voting. And so they weren't doing it behind sheets then, and they're not doing it behind sheets now. Like they've taken the sheets off, y'all. And like we have to see that the subversion of democracy, like we're really on the brink of that subversion of democracy, and that attacking voting rights is one of the ways, one of the principal ways in which they will, the pillars that they'll attack is through our right to vote. And so it's crucial that we understand the historical implications of these relics still existing in our current government, the way that we govern ourselves currently. Even though no one is checking, the fact that that is still there, someone could start checking.
And that also targets immigrants. And now we have our new citizens, our citizens from other countries that may have issues. So it was put in during the Jim Crow for literacy tests, but that will now transcend if it's ever reactivated, that it could affect many other voters.
That's right, because we don't have any language. Go ahead.
Excuse me. I'm sorry. Go ahead, doctor. I was just saying it's because you have to be able to read and write any paragraph of the Constitution in English. And so, like, you know, that could impact lots of people just because of the way we've disinvested from education in this country. But anyway,
well,
we're not going there right now.
Yeah, this is we have enough for an hour or more with voting rights. So
we can do a lot.
Well, what I was going to say is, and there aren't any language minority districts in North Carolina. So if you have a more than 5% of any language minorities in certain places, then that kicks in Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, which means you have to have ballots in multiple languages. And we have a pretty high percentage. And in fact, I think some people thought that we would have maybe Mecklenburg County would end up being 203 Voting Rights Act, and we would have at least Spanish ballots, but we don't. So there's still a lot of people who are voting in what is not their, that are citizens that have the right to vote. That don't have full access because they don't understand the language as well.
Talk to me about, I know this is in some ways terrible moment to be asking this question, framed as the promise of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act because of the recent turn of events in terms of it being stalled in the Senate. And but tell me what kinds of things would the John Lewis Voting Rights Act update, firm up? How would it impact the sort of slippage that's happened with the Voting Rights Act in the last few decades?
Well, it would restore basically the tenets of the Voting Rights Act, so that Section 5 would be back in force, and you would have to make sure that any election laws that are changed or put in place do not discriminate in any way voters, minority voters, voters of, whatever, Native American voters. I keep thinking of, in Arizona where they are not allowing the drop boxes, but that so many people live so far in the reservation. And so these things like that would not happen. So from what I understand, the John Lewis right would definitely restore a lot of what was taken away from the Voting Rights Act.
So it's difficult to understand too, from the perspective of this polarization, why something that had passed with such bipartisan majorities on every time it was reauthorized, that this isn't something that the Senate could easily take up. And it's not clear to me why some of the Democrats that are voting against, or that don't Manchin, right? Why this would happen? As a political scientist, I'm scratching my head.
Well, as a Black person, I'm not. As a Black person, it makes plenty of sense to me. As a Black person that has to live in a country that routinely disconnects and disenfranchises and disappears me and my people, it's now coming into white folks' consciousness that this is something that we deal with every day. And now when you begin to see it in your realm of possibility that you can now be disconnected and disenfranchised, I think now it becomes like this thing, right? And Joe Manchin is just doing what the status quo is requiring him to do. We often talk about like, what is our greatest threat? And we think about it's white supremacy, but capitalism. It is capitalism. And not to like go into this rant about capitalism, but like literally it is the economy and it is the commodification and subjugation of bodies and of identities is why we have the political setup that we have. And we have folks like Joe Manchin who have been, we know who Joe Manchin is. Like, he's been this way. This is not an overnight, like, you know what I mean? Like, the Senate is not passing this because they don't want the status quo to be disrupted, because the way that they do business right now is beneficial to them. And until we, the people, decide that the way that they're doing business is not what we can support, then we have to show up to the polls. We have to vote Joe Manchin out, because he is even going against what the people who he say he representing. The miners have asked him to please don't do this, please. And he still saying that, nah, I know better than you. So we have to name those things and recognize it for what it is. And we also have to look to those groups that have historically had to deal with these types of issues and grapple with these issues, to look for the talking points, to look for the messaging, and how do we rally together, because they're the ones who have been having to strategize and create the tactics all along. And so, yeah, I'm not surprised that Joe Manchin acting crazy. I'm just glad that everybody's seeing that he's crazy now, because we've been knew he was acting up. I mean, they all acting up in my estimation, Democrat, Republican. Black people are tired. No matter who we vote for, the material conditions of our lives don't change. Like, Republican, Democrat, you still Black in America, you are still at risk of being prosecuted, persecuted just for being Black and poor. That doesn't change no matter who you vote for. So what we're voting for as Black people is the hope that things get better. That we have faith that things will get better, but it's not the real concrete evidence that things are going to get better for us. And I think that's what, politicians are going to have to start like addressing, that the concrete conditions of people's existence is not getting better, despite the pandering, despite the promises, despite the platform and the planks and all those things.
I heard a great speaker a couple of weeks ago, and I meant to look up this work, but the person had suggested that, Black people have always worked within the system to try and change the system. And yet, the people who were rioting in the Capitol didn't like the election result. Instead of working within the system, they were not working within the system, right? Like, Black people in the United States have worked very diligently and hard for voting rights, and have worked very diligently and hard at mobilization and creative ways of mobilizing voters. And most elections haven't really gone the way of Black Americans.
Despite the long lines, despite not having enough polls in your neighborhoods, despite not having, the prescription of poverty that we have in this country, like, poverty is prescribed and poverty is very violent. And so, like, what we never have is like an estimation of the violence of the system, the violence of voter suppression. What does it feel like to go to a poll and to be looked at as if you don't belong, for people to be looking at you, questioning you, for people to ask you for your ID, to never have, I was 30 something years old because of felony disenfranchisement before I was able to vote. You know how intimidating that is, to stand in a long line, to not know where you're going, to feel like you should already know, because aren't you about 30 years old? Shouldn't you been here about 5 or 6 times already? And I'm standing here like, I don't know what to do. This ballot has lots of names. I don't know all these people. And so it can be very overwhelming and very intimidating. Not everyone goes to the polls with their parents as little children and has this experience. Sometimes you are scrapping and scraping just to get by and to live, and to be civically engaged is a luxury oftentimes that Black communities don't have. And despite their poverty, they show up. And so, like, what we have to do is like figure out, how do we not only get them to show up, but give them somebody to show up for, and something material that they can hold on to that's going to be better for them. That is what we're looking for now, because we've had a Black president and nothing changed. You know what I'm saying? Like, everybody thought Barack Obama was going to be the great Black hope. Like, they just think if you hang your hat on transactional changes like race, we actually need transformational change, where we're looking at like a person's politics, like, what do they believe? We saw Joe Biden tell us that he was going to get rid of student loans, lied to us, and doing everything he can not to get rid of student loans, right? Like, we have to, those are the types of accountability measures that we need to put in place, because if they have not had a payment for student loans in years, and democracy has not failed, the economy has not crashed, you can hold your campaign promise. But why doesn't he hold his campaign promise? Because the people The people are tired. We're watching January 6th happen, and we're watching all these other people act like January 6th wasn't what it was, and we're watching all these other people act like January 6th is what should happen when you feel. There's a person in Michigan right now whose campaign slogan, y'all, is locked and loaded, and that the Second Amendment is your right that you need to be worried about, and that if you vote for him, when things don't go your way, you can lock and load and show up with your gun to the government and say, I don't like what y'all doing, and use your gun and be locked and loaded as a way of like getting what you want. So what we've seen, the fallout from January 6th, is that now we see more and more people across the country are empowered to try to subvert democracy, subvert elections. And that is what the real threat is.
Can I throw in a question from the audience? This seems relevant because we're talking about accountability. So how do we effectively hold our elected officials accountable? What are some ways we do that? And what are the limits of the ways we can do that? I see Kristie shaking her head.
And I think probably have different answers, because I think attorneys can always think of limits. I think of no limits. If you are a constituent, and if I voted for you, I feel like I have every right to say whatever I feel about your record, what you're doing, how my family feels. The best advocates are people who vote, who are your constituent. Whether you voted for a person or not, you're their constituent, right? And so using your advocacy, your voice, and really talking about the impact of their action or inaction on your family, and how that lack of action or how that action directly impacted you, and forecast for them what that looks like. That's the best advocacy that you have as an individual. As a group, your best advocacy tool is organizing, and then when it's time, mobilizing. Because that mobilization is important, especially when we're talking about voting, because you can organize in the off election years so that you can mobilize during the election years, and really have your people turn out in powerful ways. And it doesn't take a lot of numbers to sway an election, y'all. And even if you don't win, if you can take some of their numbers, like if they won by 10,000 last time, but now you done cut it down and they won by 3, they hear you, they see you, they know that, and they respond to that. So there's lots of different ways that you can organize around electoral engagement.
Mm-hmm. And there's elections every year. And that's one thing that sometimes people, life is busy. You get very busy, and understanding that when you look at the big election, the federal, or you're looking at Senate, you need to also look at your local, like we have local elections coming up, and they have some of the lowest voter turnout. So when you talk about mobilizing, it's more educating and understanding that, you can hold people accountable, but you need to start at the local level. That's what affects you more on a daily basis. And we are involved in a program called Cities Fortifying Democracy. And it is 12 cities, international. So it's 6 in Europe, 6 here. And it is very interesting to listen to the fact that the premise is that cities are the petri dish. Cities are the way that you can save and keep democracy intact. They're the ones that can get creative. They're the ones that can find ways to get people out, to make, empower people. But yet you talk to people in Warsaw, and you talk to people in Athens, and you talk to people in Oklahoma City, and it is continually, how do we get people engaged in the local elections? And so that's one thing that we as the league are trying to get people to understand. There's an election every year, and you need to vote. We need to help empower and inform voters, because that's what's going to start holding people accountable.
Just as a follow-up, maybe this is for Regan, who might be the expert on this, although feel free to jump in. Kristie, but where is a good place for folks to find info on all local elections? One kind of comprehensive place to go.
Well, I'm going to kind of hawk our wares. The league,
I'd hawk your wares too.
We have a site called Vote 411. And I don't know if everyone knows, but we are a nonpartisan organization. We just want to empower you to vote what aligns with your family and your values. But you need to be educated. So our site has information. We ask questions, pertinent questions about different areas about the candidates. We hope that they answer us. so that you can get and be an informed voter. You can go to vote41.org. You can check if you're registered to vote. You can then look at the candidates in your area and see where they stand on different issues. I know that there's Ballotopia. Michelle Obama has a wonderful site that does that as well. So there are some places. It's not as easy. And I think people get overwhelmed. Like, we'll be out doing voter registration and they're like, oh, I don't know where to find. You know, you don't have that paper to look. You don't have this. So there are sites. I like ours. We do try. Sorry. We do.
Hawking your wares is welcome here. Keep it right. If your wares are good, you may hawk them here.
No, we do try and get everybody to participate so that we can empower voters. So there are sites out there. It's not as easy as it used to be.
No, it's not. I always tell people to put in your county election board or the North Carolina State Election Board. I think, you could find like the North Carolina State Election Board has gotten way more intentional about social media communication as well. And many of the counties, not all, are also more intentional about that. But going to the, definitely you could check your voter registration on the League of Women Voters website, but you can also go and check your registration on the North Carolina State Board of Elections website. And all it takes is Googling North Carolina State Board of Elections or Mecklenburg County Board of Elections. And you can find that, and they're much better than they used to be. The many local election authorities do need to work on that. But in North Carolina, it's, good place to check your registration.
Well, and it's interesting, like at the Board of Elections, they have a little, check your vote status, and that is vote 411. I did not know, but once you get up and you find you're registered, if you click on your name, that will then give you the precinct that you vote in, where you're voting. Like, most people don't understand what precinct they're in, so they don't even know who they're supposed to. And I am part of those most people. I am not. I'm like, oh wait, where am I again? Not
well, great. And
I was an early voter.
A good bit of information. The Mecklenburg County Election Board has precinct maps.
Oh yeah, they have a lot on there.
Right. The kind of voting equipment they use. So they do work, and a lot of, like I said, local election authorities are working more to the extent they can afford to do it, because they're chronically underfunded. Are working on kind of voter education. So,
I want to take us all backwards in time just for a few minutes, because I want to pick up on Kristie's mention of felony disenfranchisement to kind of open the gates to talk a little bit about some of the most prevalent forms of voter suppression that voters in this state and this country are dealing with right now in 2022. I'm going to get Kristie to kick us off.
Some of the most prevalent ones, voter ID, I think is one, right? That is a huge threat. But when we talk about, I want people to look at felony disenfranchisement. I'll get to that in a second. But I would say when you pull up to a polling place and you see the line wrapped around the building, that is voter suppression in action, because we have enough technology for you not to have to stand in a line that is wrapped around the building. That is by design for you to get frustrated and say, anybody got time for this? I got to get to work. You know what I'm saying? And so again, when you look at the ways in which our budget, that we have a slush fund in the state of North Carolina that is over $10 billion just for a rainy day due to savings that we have from the divestment in all of our systems at the state legislature level, right? There is enough money for us to have voting machines everywhere for everybody, every time. But the fact that they will not invest in it lets you know that it is with that same surgical precision that they are ensuring that people do not have enough machines in their communities, right? That is voter suppression 101. And then when you see the memes talking about that Black people can stand in the line at Popeyes for chicken, but can't stand in the line to vote, you have to recognize that is a racist trope, and that is a racist narrative. That is not true. because number one, Black people have always stood up and stood in line. And if we think about our ancestor, Fannie Lou Hamer, who was beaten, who was removed from her home and evicted and beaten by police just for trying to register to vote in Mississippi, then you understand how precious the right to vote is and how precious the Black vote is, because they wouldn't be trying to keep you from it if it weren't. So that's number one. And so when they couldn't figure out, like, poll test didn't work, poll tax didn't work, literacy tests, all those things were ruled. So then they had to figure out, well, how can we disconnect people from their constitutional right to vote? And so the 13th Amendment allowed the loophole that says that, slavery is abolished unless you are convicted of a crime. At that point, your citizenship status is reduced from full citizenship to second-class citizenship upon conviction of a crime. And so felony disenfranchisement is where people who have been convicted of crimes, of felonies, are now allowed to vote. And in North Carolina, that affects thousands upon thousands and thousands of mostly Black and brown people, and especially poor people. And, there is a lawsuit that was filed by our comrades at For Justice last year that restored the right of 56,000 people in August. It was decided by a 3-panel judge, Superior Court judges, who said, yes, that these people were only unable to vote because of the fees and fines that they were unable to pay. And so because they were unable to pay money, they were held on probation. And because of that probation, they were locked out of voting. And so 56,000 people had their right to vote restored. But in August, the Court of Appeals temporarily blocked. And so that block is still happening. But the good news is that those 56,000 people that were eligible to vote, lots of those people did register during that time and are now going to be voting for the first time. And so it is really important that we continue to monitor that situation and ensure that folks like states like Massachusetts, where even people in prison can vote, we should be doing that here in North Carolina.
So I want to address the funding issue, because in North Carolina, for the most part, funding for elections comes from our our counties. And so counties are forced to make decisions between, filling the potholes or having more voting machines. And, it's an interesting point that you bring up, right? Even like in challenging, I had a discussion about voter ID with a senator once, and I asked him, so where's the money for this coming? Because if you think about, free IDs and all the things that we could actually, if we had voter ID, we would absolutely have to do, which are problematic. We won't even go there, but I'm like, where's the money coming from? He's like, the normal budgetary process. And I'm like, well, now that I've been studying that normal budgetary process, this is like local little counties trying to come up with money to make sure people can vote. And yes, sometimes it is political. Some of my research has found that in North Carolina. I know you're shocked, Kristie. I can see it on your face. But that this lack of funding and lack of adequate funding, and even in the face of a pandemic, it's absolutely criminal that we don't have enough money to run elections. And then when a philanthropy steps in to do something about it, sure, I haven't done the research, but the Wall Street Journal reported that a lot of that money from, say, Facebook went mostly to Democratic counties. And my argument was, well, they were the ones that were willing to ask it, and probably the ones that were their counties were least likely to be able to afford it in the first place, and they needed to protect their voters. And so North Carolina last year had introduced, and it went away, the trying to disallow local election boards from being able to pay for or to get philanthropy from the community or from anybody. Well, how long do they survive on? They get all kinds of in-kind contributions from the community to run elections. They shouldn't have to, right? If they're really, $10 billion rainy day fund, they shouldn't ever have to. But so that's a chronic problem. There are just, there's so many problems with elections. But I think the biggest thing to realize is that they all tend to work together to make it impossible, or not impossible, but difficult to vote, right? And I've been asked, well, what's the single worst piece of legislation? I would have a hard time putting my finger on it, because usually what I see is things that work together to disenfranchise. I would always say education is the best thing, but even that, right, isn't going to help in the face of some of these legislative.
Well, and now we're in the midst of the redistricting.
Oh,
and that's a whole nother. And right now, that is one of the most important things we're looking at. And that is one of the biggest ways that we can disenfranchise voters, is by drawing the maps so that their voice is not necessarily heard. And I know everyone is aware of what's going on right now. And I think it's February 23rd that the decision is supposed to come down as to where the new maps are. But on February 24th, it's supposed to be candidate filing. So if the new maps come down and they decide to change the election date from the 17th to June 7th, or something like that happens, then where are people? I mean, that also not only is redistricting, but the changing of things. People can't keep up. So then where are we coming out? What are we doing? So redistricting and fair maps, and the league supports and is very vocal in their support for, the fair maps. But we'll see what happens with that. And then what happens with candidate filing? That is a very close timeline. And when is that going to happen? And I wanted to address Kristie's with the felon. I do some voter registration in places where we run into people who will tell me, oh, we can't vote. And it is often because they have been in or been convicted of a felony, and I can't vote. And I'll say, well, are you on parole? Because right now, if you're on parole, you can't. And they'll say, nope, I've been off for 20 years. I'm fine. And I said, well, you can vote. Well, no, I can't. So the difference in the laws in the states is another form of suppression, because, you've got a lot going on, and you may not know in one state, once you're done with parole, you can register. So you just step away from everything. So I think that having all these different laws also causes such a problem.
It really, really does.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, different laws make it so that a small community can run an election different than in LA. Riley County, Kansas can run an election differently than Los Angeles, right? Or Yellowstone, Montana, and so, I mean, while I disagree with some people who make the arguments that a lot of these federal laws are just going to result in federal takeover elections, that's just BS rhetoric, right? But I think that there has to be some difference. It's just that it does make for problems when we're talking about knowledge about elections, definitely, because people take their knowledge from one area and they apply it to where they are now. I had a family member who said the exact same. I can't vote. We're like, my husband and I said to him, yes, you can. You need to register.
I think what Regan is saying, though, is yes, we should hold space for a Yellowstone, Montana to be able to run their things differently, but that your citizenship status should not change when you cross state lines. And I think that's what we're saying, is that you should know that you are a full citizen, no matter where you travel in these United States. And if we look at what's happening in Tennessee right now, one of the founders of a Black Lives Matter chapter registered to vote and was convicted and sentenced to 6 years for registering, because her probation officer told her she could register to vote. So her probation officer had erroneous information, and now she's been convicted and sentenced to 6 years in a prison for registering to vote. And that is in our next door neighbor state that used to be a part of North Carolina. So we have to I am all for differences and holding space for differences, but I also think you should still have a certain standard of what a citizen, what your rights of citizenship guarantee, no matter where you travel in this.
Good point.
Yes, That's more what I was going to. You're just much more eloquent, Kristie.
Right?
Are you talking about the Pam Moses
You're right,
case?
though, Reagan. You're right. I mean, it is these differences, and people get in their minds how things are supposed to be. And you hear students, as a university professor, that say, "Well, this is how it is," and I'm like, "Well, not in North Carolina, right? It's a different system here. Well, we use this kind of, we voted on this. Well, we don't here. There are so many differences, and there's got to be a way to have believable civic education and not misinformation." And I know I have a lot of very excellent colleagues that are working on the misinformation question. And it's a problem. Right? Different states, different policies. It's confusing.
I want to take, actually, I want to ask a follow-up to Kristie, which is, are you talking about the Pam Moses case in Memphis? Just for if people want to look up the registering to vote, criminalization of registering to vote that Kristie was talking about. The woman's name is Pam Moses. And also we get a question in the chat about states where people are allowed to vote when they're in prison, which I think is Vermont and Maine. Is that true? Like throughout,
Vermont,
they maintain the ability.
Vermont and Maine, they can vote the entire time. North Carolina's not bad. We are bad. Let me say it. We're in the middle of the road. It can get much worse than where we are. Let me say that. We're in the middle of the road, which, like to what Reagan said earlier, if you have completed all the terms and conditions, whether that probation or parole, you are automatically eligible to vote. In some places, you have to apply for the restoration once your sentence is finished. And there are some places like Louisiana and Alabama, Mississippi, where you will never be eligible to vote once you are convicted of a felony ever again. It is a lifetime ban. And so, disenfranchisement in the Deep South looks like a life sentence of not being eligible to vote. We are somewhat lucky in North Carolina that, after we complete our sentences, we are allowed to vote again.
And if you are not convicted of a felony, if you're incarcerated, but you're not convicted of a felony, you can register and vote, and you should be able to vote, even if you're in jail, if it's not a felony. And so that's something that people also, which then comes up, if we do the voter ID, how do we get IDs matching this? So that goes down a whole nother path. But and that's, again, confusing for people.
Yep. I want to also, before we turn to more questions and things, I want to raise an issue via a great question from an audience member that Martha and I discussed when we were sort of talking before we had this panel. The question is, are NC election laws being changed for the worse as in other states, and at the state level, are election officials being threatened, leaving, or being replaced by partisans or elsewhere? So we had discussed the sort of role of partisanship in elections, particularly since 2020, as electors are being sort of replaced by people who are more partisan. Thoughts on that trend?
So in talking with the state election director of elections, she would say that North Carolina election officials have faced a lot less threats than others from our conversation. But we know that this is an ever-present problem all over the country, that local election officials are retiring and quitting, and people who are good at their jobs and want to continue. This is sort of the other side of this voter suppression problem, right? There are the laws that get us out to vote, but then if, somebody takes that result and sets it aside, it's not going to matter, how much mobilization you do, because it's so what there has been a lot of discussion about whether local election officials and the secretaries of states or whoever the chief election officer in the state should be a partisan person. In North Carolina, we have a bipartisan board with, typically a majority of whoever the gubernatorial party is. And then they elect they'll hire a professional to run the elections, and it's not that way in every state. You want to talk about confusion. My home state, we voted on a partisan ballot for our local election official, the county clerk, who also incidentally had about 50 other jobs that he or she had to do at the same time that they're, running elections, which I don't know how anyone could do that. But so, the real question is, we are seeing increasing citizen commissions for redistricting. Why can't we try to pull out some of the partisanship, or at least institute bipartisanship where it concerns local election officials? And there is a rising worry, though, that some of these polarized partisans, the locked and loaded guy, that those types of folks are trying to vie for some of the positions now, as the county clerk or the secretary of state. And that's a problem.
I think in Georgia, they have a real problem with that right now in some of the counties. And it's actually counties that have a higher Black voting base. They're taking the people out and putting more partisan people in. We just actually, again, hawking our words, we're doing a program, Civics 101. And we were just filming at the Board of Elections today. We're bringing the Board of Elections in. And they were talking about how right now they are very nonpartisan, and we'll get to talk to both a Democrat and a Republican board member. But I know also in talking to people, the 2020 election, someone referred once to PTSD from all the threats and all the things that went on. So I don't see it right now in my little purview here in Mecklenburg County. I cannot speak to the greater. I know other states are having a big problem.
I could see a place like Alamance County just being disruptive. I could see a place like that where Confederates and neo-nationalists and the Proud Boys are regularly convening at the Confederate Monument in downtown Graham. So I could see that type of, we have seen it happening. Like the Proud Boys were at a Orange County Board of Elections. I'm not Board of Elections. They were at the Orange County school board meeting because of critical race theory. So we've seen, folks show up to threaten and intimidate and coerce, elected officials. And we've seen, since January 6th, I think people really now see these as a viable threat, as a homegrown terrorist, for seeing them for truly who they are. And I think that is we're going to have to see more of that. And there are some all across the state this month. There are some neo-Confederate Proud Boy gatherings happening all month, and they are on that side. They are doing political education. They are organizing and mobilizing around what we would define as sedition and treasonous behaviors, but to subvert democracy. But that is actively happening right now. So like those of us who want to defend democracy really need to be nonpartisan. We need to just be defenders of democracy and put the parties down, because we're not going to have anything. It's not going to be a party if the people who have their way get their way, who want their way, get their way. We won't have to worry about is it a donkey or elephant. We're going to have to worry about, do we have food today? You know what I mean? Because we're going to be living in a really, really fragile time. They almost won in 2020 and were successful in Michigan, when those 500 people showed up to that, polling place where they were getting ready to steal the election. And those 500 people like, that was the first domino that was supposed to create this whole thing, right? And it didn't happen. And so that's why we saw January 6th, right? And so like we have to know that 2022 is another dry run. And 2024 will be them really trying to advance their narrative that, Black, brown, immigrants, people who do not fall into white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant confines do not belong in this country and need to obey and comply. And there's this like really law and order rhetoric that we will begin to see permeate our culture.
I want to turn to my favorite part of one of these programs. The series is called What's It Gonna Take? And we love, as I mentioned to each of you before the panel, to give out suggestions about places where people can get involved, participate in organizing activities if that's what they want, just learn more if that's their thing. We've also gotten a thematic group of questions in the chat about local leaders in organizing and mobilizing. We got a question about where should I be on election day 2022 to ensure the rights of others are protected? What should I be doing? And then a question just now against how do we stand up against these folks? What are our groups doing to defend democracy? So I would love to just go around to each of you and ask, can be a learning resource, can be an organizing resource. What are some places that we can direct folks who are in the audience for this program to learn more or do more to work towards democracy and protect voting rights and exercise the right to vote? Let's start with Regan.
Well, of course, you know, the League of Women Voters has historically, since 1920, worked to empower and defend democracy. And we have worked with coalition partners like Common Cause, Southern Coalition for Social Justice, ACLU, in major court cases to defend and continue defending everyone's right to vote. No matter your opinion, no matter where you stand, it's your right to vote and your right to have a say. I am a big believer in, you know, we do a lot of voter registration, but it's more the education part, because you can register all the live long day, but until people understand the importance of going out and voting and the importance of what you are trying to protect and preserve. So, you know, the League of Women Voters does that. I know there's other organizations you can vote. Amy Steele's the New North Carolina Project, where they're working at getting rural and Black voters to get engaged and come back out. So there are organizations that work to empower and educate people on the importance, because there's a lot of noise. We need to learn, again, I'm going to our civics, but we're having a media panel, and it is now with information, disinformation. How do you become a savvy media consumer? Like, listening to all this, I'm not going to go to a poll because I'm going to be attacked, and you know, I don't know this. So we need to educate and get people to understand. And that's a hard thing, but that's I think a goal that we all have to continue to enfranchise all our citizens.
You know, I have been working with Democracy North Carolina on and off since I moved to North Carolina, and I found that to be just a good group in terms of their monitoring local election officials, but also educating and mobilizing voters, trying to get people registered. And you know, I think part of what their work is now is trying to get information into the hands of people, and transparent information. And I, you know, through kind of service learning, I have appreciated that. But, you know, the best thing I could tell people to do, though, is to just pay attention to to as many different sources of news media as you can. I know it's hard, people are busy. But try not to, there are, you know, if I can get it before the program ends, there's a good site that talks about where different media sources are on a continuum of conservative to liberal. And so I always say, pick some in the middle, pick one here, pick one here. That's what I tell my students, but you know, that read, watch the news.
Yeah, and at the ACLU, you know, we do similar work to our other partners, the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, Democracy NC, Southern Coalition for Social Justice. We do lots of talk. We try to do a lot of public education, political education. We understand that most people don't understand the way government works. And when you don't understand the way anything works, you think everything is a conspiracy theory. And so what we've tried to do is to give people the tools that they need to really investigate how does government work. And how is it working either for or against you, and then how to engage. Because once you know how a system works, you can understand how to disrupt or agitate that system in powerful transformational ways. And so we have programs called Renegade Advocacy. We have the Smart Justice Fellows. I manage the campaign for Smart Justice. Go to our website, sign up, become a volunteer. We have Defenders of Democracy, where we're going to be training you to defend democracy. Come when it's time, we're going to mount up and have a rapid response, right? We also have stuff if you don't want to show up like that. I get it. Everybody can't mount up and show up and circle the wagon. Sometimes people have to do other things. And so we want to have space and grace for whatever role you can play. There is a role for you to volunteer with the ACLU. Will be directing community engagement team. And so you'll be working with me. And I would be happy to have anyone who would like to volunteer to learn more or to even connect you with partners. There is another partner that we work with, Vote Riders. Vote Riders specifically works to combat the voter ID. Pam Pearson. Pam Pearson and all the good folks over there work really diligently to make sure that everyone has an ID, but not just an ID, y'all, because an ID is important. But do you know there are underlying documents that you need to get your ID? So if you do not have your birth certificate, if you do not have your social security card, Pamela will help you get that social security card, that birth certificate, pay for it, make you an appointment at the DMV, pay the lift for you to get to the DMV, make sure you get the doggone thing, get your ID, and come on out. Right. And so we always want to make sure that we're uplifting the work of Vote Riders to make sure that unconstitutional, constitutional.
I want to second Kristie. I work a lot with Pam and Vote Riders. They are phenomenal. They help people because it's voting, but you can't re-engage in society if you don't have your IDs.
That's right.
They are doing things. They're wonderful.
Yep. That's great.
I think we got so many great comments and questions in the chat for us. I don't know if you all have been able to peek over at it. And I think we addressed many of them. A few follow-up questions I want to apologize for missing, just about local board of elections and also the situation in Florida with the referendum that the state legislature overturned, which we did. I accidentally passed by in our brief conversation about felonies. That is an excellent question from Sam. I want to give each of you, because it feels like scratch the surface on voting rights. I want to give each of you the chance to press go on an issue you'd love for people in this program to follow up on, maybe that we didn't get the chance to talk about very much, because there's really so much here with voting rights. A final word from each of you, sending people off with inspiration. Putting you on the spot.
It's so complicated, right?
I know.
It's not. It's simple. Just go to a good nonpartisan source and learn about elections if you can do nothing else. Try and learn what to do. That's
overcome the noise and be an engaged citizen, because it's for you and your family, as well as everything else. So.
And I'll just leave you with the 2002 Supreme Court opinion that says that the fundamental right to vote includes the right to enjoy, not stand in long ass lines, but to enjoy substantially equal voting power and substantially equal representation. And that is what voting rights is about, is that we are ensuring that the right to vote is equal in results in equal voting power, but also in equal representation, which is a fundamental. This country was founded on what? No taxation without representation. And so the ability to have representation is an integral part. It was woven into the fabric, the tapestry of this country. And we have to acknowledge that our forefathers thought that democracy and voting was so important that they came here to establish that. And so, I don't agree with everything they did, but I do agree that we need democracy. So we have to continue to make progress and dare to create, as the ACLU says, a more perfect union.
And I'm going to stick in my own final word, even though I'm the moderator. I want to encourage folks to pursue a group with deep intersection with the groups that we've talked about on this panel, which are voters with disabilities, and the ways that they experience their own voter disenfranchisement. And we can be doing better for them at polling places in terms of access. Many things about access we didn't get to. The three of you have been the best panelists that a lady could wish for. Thank you for the terrific conversation. Thank you to the audience. And maybe we'll get the chance to all come back and do it again.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night,
Thank
everyone.
Wonderful moderator.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Franky.
Bye-bye.
Fun talking.